by Fate's decree. When her father was sentenced to die, Lady Isolde of Evermere had only one choice: plead for help from Sir Aldrich Blackwell, a knight feared for his lack of mercy. He leaned in, his smirk unreadable. "You ask for my help, my lady," he murmured. "But tell me, do you have the courage to pay my price?" Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Gallows. The chill of the pre-dawn air seeped through the thick stone walls of Evermere Castle, settling deep into Isolde's bones. It mirrored the icy dread that had taken root in her heart, a relentless frost that no fire could thaw. She stared out the narrow window, her breath fogging the glass, at the courtyard below. Even from this distance, she could see the stark, skeletal outline of the gallows, freshly erected, its wood still raw and pale against the gray morning sky. It was a monstrous, obscene thing, a stark reminder of the brutal reality that awaited her father. Lord Edmund of Evermere, a man whose laughter had once filled these very halls, was now condemned to die. Accused of treason against King Theodore, a charge Isolde knew to be false, he awaited the executioner's axe at sunrise. Her father, a man of unwavering loyalty, a man who had served the crown with distinction for decades, reduced to this. The injustice of it burned in her throat, a bitter, acrid taste of despair. She clutched the heavy woolen cloak tighter around her, the rough fabric a small comfort against the biting wind that whistled through the battlements. Her fingers traced the embroidered crest of Evermere, a silver stag leaping against a field of emerald green, a symbol of their proud lineage, a lineage now teetering on the brink of ruin. Isolde had spent the night in a desperate, frantic search for a solution, a way to save her father. She had sent pleas to every noble house she could think of, begging for their intervention, their influence. But the responses, when they came, were all the same: carefully worded condolences, veiled excuses, and thinly disguised fear. King Theodore's wrath was a terrible thing, and no one dared risk incurring it, not even for a man as respected as Lord Edmund. Her gaze fell upon the small, worn prayer book lying on the table beside her bed. It had been her mother's, its pages filled with delicate illuminations and handwritten prayers. Isolde had clung to it throughout the long, agonizing night, seeking solace in its familiar words, but even faith seemed to offer little comfort now. Her mother, Alara, had died years ago, succumbing to a fever that had swept through Evermere like a wildfire. Isolde often wondered if her mother's gentle spirit would have found a way, a solution that eluded her now. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, desperate sound that echoed in the empty chamber. She pressed her hand against her mouth, stifling the cry. She could not afford to break down, not now. She had to be strong, for her father, for Evermere. There was one last, desperate hope, a name whispered in hushed tones, a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest knights: Sir Aldrich Blackwell, known throughout the land as the Iron Wolf. A warrior of legendary skill and ruthlessness, he was a man who operated outside the usual constraints of courtly politics, a man who answered only to his own code. He was also a man known for his unconventional methods. Isolde had heard the stories, the rumors that painted him as a cold, calculating figure, a man who demanded a high price for his services. But he was also known for his unwavering effectiveness. If anyone could navigate the treacherous currents of the royal court and secure her father's freedom, it was him. The thought of approaching him terrified her. He was a stranger, a dangerous man, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. But she had no other choice. Her father's life hung in the balance, and she would do anything, to save him. A sudden commotion in the courtyard below drew her attention. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pale gold and rose, illuminating the grim scene below. The guards were leading her father from the dungeons, his hands bound, his head held high despite the tremor in his steps. Isolde's heart clenched. He looked so frail, so vulnerable, stripped of his noble robes and reduced to a prisoner's rough-spun tunic. But even in this moment of utter despair, she saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes, a spark of the unwavering spirit that had always defined him. She watched as he was led towards the gallows, the crowd of onlookers parting before him like the Red Sea. She could hear the murmurs, the whispers, the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity that followed him. It was then that she made her decision. She would go to the Iron Wolf. She would plead for his help, and she would pay whatever price he demanded. Her own reputation, her own future, none of it mattered. Only her father's life. She turned from the window, her movements swift and decisive. She would not waste another moment. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple, unadorned gown of dark blue, a color that would not draw undue attention. She braided her long, auburn hair, securing it tightly at the nape of her neck. She needed to appear strong, composed, even if her insides were churning with fear and desperation. She slipped out of her chamber, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. The castle was still mostly asleep, the servants not yet stirring. She moved like a shadow, avoiding the few guards who were on duty, her heart pounding in her chest with every step. She reached the stables, the scent of hay and horses filling the air. Her own mare, a spirited chestnut named Willow, whinnied softly in recognition. Isolde stroked her velvety nose, finding a fleeting moment of comfort in the familiar gesture. "We have a long journey ahead of us, girl," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "A journey into the unknown." She saddled Willow herself, her hands moving with a practiced ease that belied her inner turmoil. She mounted, her grip tight on the reins, and urged the mare forward, out of the castle gates and into the cold, gray dawn. As she rode away from Evermere, leaving behind everything she knew and loved, she looked back one last time at the towering silhouette of the castle against the lightning sky. The gallows stood stark and ominous in the courtyard, a constant reminder of the perilous path she had chosen. But as she turned her face towards the rising sun, a flicker of determination ignited within her. She would face the Iron Wolf, and she would save her father, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. The Iron Wolf's Denver. The journey to Blackwell Keep was a grueling 3-day ride, each day colder and more desolate than the last. Isolde pushed Willow hard, stopping only for brief rests and snatches of uneasy sleep in roadside inns, the kind frequented more by wary travelers than noble ladies. She ate sparingly, her stomach too tightly knotted with anxiety to hold much food. The faces she encountered along the way were a blur of suspicion and indifference, each a reflection of the perilous world she had entered. The landscape itself seemed to mirror her inner turmoil. The rolling hills and verdant fields of Evermere gradually gave way to a starker, more forbidding terrain. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches bare and skeletal against the gray sky. The wind howled relentlessly, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, and a hint of something colder, something metallic. By the third day, Isolde was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The constant fear, the lack of sleep, and the relentless journey had taken their toll. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling of being utterly alone in a world that seemed indifferent to her plight. Yet, she pressed on, driven by the unwavering image of her father's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape, she saw it. Blackwell Keep. It was not a beautiful castle, like Evermere, with its soaring towers and elegant courtyards. This was a fortress, a stark, imposing structure built for war, not comfort. It rose from a rocky outcrop, its gray stone walls blending seamlessly with the surrounding landscape, as if it had grown organically from the earth itself. The keep was surrounded by a deep moat, spanned by a single, heavily guarded drawbridge. The air around it crackled with a sense of menace, a silent warning to any who dared approach uninvited. Isolde felt a shiver run down her spine, a primal fear that resonated deep within her bones. This was the lair of the Iron Wolf, a place where few ventured, and even fewer returned. She urged Willow forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the drawbridge, 2 guards emerged from the gatehouse, their faces grim and unyielding. They were clad in full-plate armor, their swords gleaming in the fading light. They looked like statues, immovable and implacable. "State your name and business," one of the guards demanded, his voice harsh and devoid of warmth. Isolde straightened in her saddle, summoning every ounce of her courage. "I am Lady Isolde of Evermere," she announced, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I seek an audience with Sir Aldrich Blackwell." The guards exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. One of them disappeared back into the gatehouse, leaving Isolde to wait, exposed and vulnerable, in the chilling evening air. The silence stretched on, broken only by the creak of the drawbridge chains and the distant caw of a raven. Isolde felt a growing sense of unease. She had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility, but this silent scrutiny was unnerving. It was as if she were being judged, weighed, assessed. She wondered if she had made a mistake, if she should have turned back. But the thought of her father, waiting in his cold, dark cell, spurred her on. Finally, the guard reappeared. "Sir Aldrich will see you," he announced, his voice still devoid of any warmth. "But you must leave your horse and come alone." Isolde hesitated for a moment, her hand instinctively reaching for Willow's reins. Leaving her horse felt like surrendering a part of herself, a symbol of her freedom and independence. But she knew she had no choice. She dismounted, her legs stiff and aching from the long ride. She handed the reins to one of the guards, her fingers lingering on Willow's soft nose for a moment, drawing strength from the familiar contact. "Follow me," the guard instructed, turning and leading her across the drawbridge. The drawbridge lowered with a groan, the heavy chains rattling like the bones of some ancient beast. Isolde stepped onto the rough-hewn planks, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she crossed the moat, she could see the dark, murky water below, reflecting the fading light like a pool of liquid night. The courtyard of Blackwell Keep was as stark and imposing as the exterior. It was a vast, empty space, paved with rough-hewn stones. There were no gardens, no fountains, no signs of life or beauty. Only the cold, gray stone walls, rising high above her, and the silent, watchful presence of the guards. The guard led her through a series of dark, winding corridors, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The only light came from flickering torches, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. She could hear the distant sounds of the keep, the clang of metal, the murmur of voices, the occasional shout, but they seemed muffled, unreal, as if she were walking through a dream. Finally, they reached a large, heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands. The guard knocked twice, the sound echoing through the corridor. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. "Lady Isolde of Evermere," the guard announced, his voice echoing in the chamber. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Isolde took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She stepped across the threshold, into the den of the Iron Wolf. The room was large and sparsely furnished. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, a fire roaring within, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. A long, heavy table stood in the center, surrounded by several chairs. Maps and charts adorned the walls, along with a collection of weapons, swords, axes, shields, each gleaming with a deadly sharpness. And then she saw him, Sir Aldrich Blackwell. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, his tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the flames. He was dressed in black, from his boots to his tunic, the only adornment a heavy silver chain bearing the sigil of a snarling wolf. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Isolde felt her breath catch in her throat. He was even more formidable than she had imagined. His face was lean and hard, etched with the lines of countless battles. His eyes, a piercing gray, seemed to bore into her, assessing her, stripping away her defenses. He had a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a stark reminder of his violent past. His hair was dark, streaked with silver, and tied back in a severe knot. He did not speak, did not offer any greeting. He simply stood there, watching her, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Isolde felt a wave of fear wash over her, a primal instinct to flee. But she stood her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze meeting his. She would not show weakness, not to this man. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chamber. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "You have traveled far to seek my aid." It was not a question. Isolde swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "My father, Lord Edmund of Evermere, has been condemned to death. I have come to ask for your help." His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. It was not a smile of amusement, but something colder, something predatory. "And what makes you think I would be interested in your father's plight?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Isolde knew that this was the moment, the turning point. She had to convince him, to offer him something he could not refuse. The shadow of the gallows loomed large, a constant pressure against her resolve. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in moonlight. Isolde took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I know your reputation, Sir Aldrich," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "I know that you are a man of influence, a man who can achieve things that others cannot." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Influence comes at a price, Lady Isolde. Are you prepared to pay it?" She met his gaze directly. "My father's life is worth any price," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching, probing. She could feel his gaze stripping away her defenses, exposing her raw desperation. It was a terrifying sensation, but she refused to flinch. "Any price?" he repeated softly, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. He moved closer, his presence filling the room, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. She could smell the scent of him: leather, steel, and something wilder, something untamed. Isolde swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Anything." He stopped directly in front of her, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. His eyes were like chips of ice, cold and unyielding, yet she saw a flicker of something else there, a hint of interest. "Your father is accused of treason," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A serious charge. The king is not known for his mercy." "The charges are false," Isolde insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "My father is a loyal servant of the crown. He has been framed by his enemies." Aldrich's lips curled into that same, unsettling smirk. "Enemies? In the royal court, everyone has enemies. It is a viper's nest of ambition and betrayal." "I know," Isolde said, her voice tight with frustration. "That is why I need your help. You are the only one who can navigate that nest, who can uncover the truth and secure my father's freedom." He leaned in, his face so close to hers that she could feel his breath on her cheek. His smirk unreadable. "You ask for my help, my lady," he murmured. "But tell me, do you have the courage to pay my price?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Isolde knew that he was not talking about gold or jewels. He was talking about something far more valuable, something personal. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had come this far. She could not back down now. "Tell me your price," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He stepped back, breaking the intense proximity, and gestured towards the large window that overlooked the courtyard. The moon had risen, casting a silvery glow over the scene below. "Come," he said, his voice still low and gravelly. Isolde followed him to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The courtyard was empty, bathed in the ethereal light of the moon. The silence was broken only by the distant howl of a wolf, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Aldrich turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "My price, Lady Isolde, is a marriage pact." The word struck her like a physical blow. She had expected many things, but not this. Marriage? To him? To the Iron Wolf? The thought was both terrifying and intriguing. Marriage? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. A union between our two houses. A bond that will tie you to me, and me to you. Isolde stared at him, her mind reeling. She had never considered marriage, not in this way. She had always assumed that she would marry for love, for companionship, not for political expediency. But her father's life hung in the balance.
Why?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why would you want to marry me? He shrugged, his broad shoulders moving slightly beneath his black tunic. Your family has influence. Your lands border mine. A union between us would be advantageous. Isolde knew that he was not telling her the whole truth. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of his cold, calculating demeanor. But she could not afford to dwell on it. She had a decision to make. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice barely audible. His eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening. Then your father dies, he said, his voice flat and devoiding feeling. The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. Isolde felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped. She had no other choice. She looked out at the moonlit courtyard, her mind racing. She thought of her father, waiting in his cold, dark cell. She thought of Evermere, her home, her family's legacy. She thought of the gallows. Waiting, she turned back to Aldrich, her gaze meeting his. I accept, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. I will marry you, Sir Aldrich, in exchange for my father's life. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face. He nodded, his expression still unreadable. Very well, he said. Then we have a pact. He extended his hand, his fingers long and strong. Isolde hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, surprisingly gentle. A strange sensation ran through her, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she could not quite define. He raised her hand to his lips, his breath warm against her skin. He did not kiss her hand, as a courtly gentleman might. Instead, he pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was both possessive and intimate. From this moment on, he said, his voice a low murmur, you are mine, Lady Isolde, and I am yours. The words sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had made a pact with the Iron Wolf, a pact that would bind her to him forever. She had saved her father's life, but at what cost? As the moon bathed them in its silvery light, she wondered if she had just traded one prison for another. The unknown future stretched before her, dark and uncertain, yet a faint spark of defiance flickered within her. She would face it, whatever it held, with her head held high. Chapter 4. The Whispers of Evermere. The return journey to Evermere was a stark contrast to the desperate flight that had brought Isolde to Blackwell Keep. She rode beside Aldrich, not as a supplicant, but as his betrothed, a status that afforded her a strange mixture of protection and unease. The fear that had gnawed at her on the outward journey was replaced by a different kind of anxiety, a deep-seated uncertainty about the future she had so abruptly chosen. Aldrich was a silent companion, for the most part. He rode with the effortless grace of a seasoned warrior, his posture erect, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. He spoke only when necessary, his words curt and to the point. He did not offer any comfort, any reassurance, any hint of the emotions that might be swirling beneath his stoic exterior. Isolde found herself stealing glances at him, studying his profile, trying to decipher the enigma that was the Iron Wolf. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. She wondered about the scar that bisected his face, the story it told of violence and survival. She wondered if there was any warmth, any tenderness, hidden beneath his cold, hard exterior. The landscape, too, seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the storm that was sure to break upon their arrival at Evermere. The vibrant autumn colors had faded, replaced by the somber hues of late fall. The wind whispered through the bare branches, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of winter. As they approached Evermere Castle, Isolde felt a familiar pang of longing, a deep ache for the home she had left behind. She wondered how her father was faring, how he had endured the agonizing wait for news. She wondered how the people of Evermere would react to her sudden, unexpected betrothal to the Iron Wolf. The castle gates swung open as they approached, the guards recognizing their lord's daughter and the infamous knight beside her. Isolde could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, relief, and apprehension. She straightened in her saddle, her chin lifted, trying to project an image of confidence, even if her insides were churning with uncertainty. The courtyard was bustling with activity, the servants rushing to and fro, preparing for the arrival of their lord's betrothed. Isolde saw familiar faces, faces that had always greeted her with smiles and warmth. But now, their expressions were guarded, uncertain, as if they were not quite sure how to react. Aldrich dismounted with a fluid grace, his movements betraying no hint of emotion. He turned to Isolde, offering his hand to help her down. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and reassuring, a small gesture that sent a surprising wave of warmth through her. As she stepped down from her horse, she saw her father standing at the entrance to the great hall, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes shining with relief. He rushed towards her, his arms outstretched, and enveloped her in a fierce embrace. "Isolde," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You are safe. You are alive." She clung to him, her own tears flowing freely. "Father," she said, her voice trembling. "I am so glad to see you." They held each other for a long moment, the bond between them stronger than ever. Isolde felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, a deep appreciation for the love that had driven her to make such a desperate bargain. Then, her father stepped back, his gaze shifting to Aldrich, who stood silently watching them. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Sir Aldrich," he said, his voice formal and guarded. "I am in your debt." Aldrich inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Your daughter has persuaded me to intervene on your behalf," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Lord Edmund's gaze returned to Isolde, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Isolde, what has happened? What have you done?" Isolde took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment she had to reveal the price of her father's freedom. "Father," she said, her voice clear and resolute, "I have agreed to marry Sir Aldrich. In exchange for your life." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. The courtyard fell silent, the servants frozen in their tasks, their eyes wide with disbelief. Lord Edmund stared at her, his face paling even further. "Marry?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "You have agreed to marry him?" He looked at Aldrich with undisguised animosity, his hand instinctively moving towards the hilt of his sword, even though he was unarmed. Aldrich remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. "Father, it was the only way," Isolde insisted, her voice pleading. "He was the only one who could save you." Lord Edmund shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and anger. "Isolde, you should not have done this. You should not have sacrificed yourself for me." "It was not a sacrifice," Isolde said, her voice firm. "It was a choice. And I would make the same choice again." She turned to Aldrich, her gaze meeting his. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of respect? Or perhaps it was simply her imagination. The whispers began to spread through the courtyard, like ripples in a pond. The news of Isolde's betrothal to the Iron Wolf spread quickly, eliciting a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. Some whispered that she had been bewitched, that she had fallen under the spell of the ruthless knight. Others whispered that she was a fool, that she had traded her freedom for a life of misery. Isolde ignored the whispers, her focus on her father. She needed to convince him, to make him understand that she had made the right decision. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a deep sadness, a sense of loss that she could not ignore. She had saved his life, but she had also broken his heart. And as the whispers of Evermere swirled around her, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Chapter 5. The Serpent in the Garden. The days following Isolde's betrothal announcement were a whirlwind of activity and hushed tension. Evermere, once a place of warmth and laughter, now felt like a stage set for a tragedy. The servants moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, but Isolde could sense their unease, their unspoken questions. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the arrival of its new master, the Iron Wolf. Lord Edmund, though freed from the gallows, remained a shadow of his former self. He spent hours in his study, poring over maps and documents, his face etched with worry. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was strained and distant. He avoided Aldrich whenever possible, his resentment a palpable presence in the air. Isolde tried to bridge the gap between her father and her betrothed, but her efforts were met with resistance from both sides. Aldrich remained aloof and unapproachable, his demeanor as cold and hard as the iron he was named for. He treated Isolde with a formal courtesy, but there was no warmth, no intimacy, in his interactions with her. One crisp autumn afternoon, Isolde found herself walking in the castle gardens, seeking a moment of solitude amidst the turmoil. The once vibrant flowers had withered, their colors faded, but the garden still held a certain beauty, a sense of peace that she desperately craved. She was startled by a voice, soft and laced with a subtle venom. Lady Isolde. She turned to see Lady Alara of Lormont, a distant cousin of her father's, standing a few feet away. Alara was a woman of striking beauty, with raven-black hair, piercing blue eyes, and a reputation for sharp wit and even sharper ambition. She had always been a frequent visitor to Evermere, but Isolde had never trusted her. There was something about her that felt false, something calculated and manipulative. Lady Alara, Isolde greeted her, her voice carefully neutral. Alara smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that did not quite reach her eyes. My dear Isolde, what a surprising turn of events. Your betrothal to Sir Aldrich has certainly set tongues wagging. Isolde stiffened, her guard immediately rising. It is a necessary alliance, she said, her voice clipped. Alara chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. Necessary? Or desperate? I hear it was the only way to save your father from the king's justice. Isolde's hands clenched into fists. My father is innocent, she said, her voice tight with anger. Alara's smile widened, revealing a hint of cruelty. Innocent? Perhaps. But innocence is a fragile thing in the royal court. It is easily shattered. She moved closer, her perfume, a heavy, cloying scent, filling the air. I must confess, Isolde, I am surprised. I always thought you had more spirit, more ambition. To settle for a man like Aldrich Blackwell, it seems a waste. Isolde met her gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. Sir Aldrich is a powerful man, she said, her voice steady. He will protect Evermere. Alara laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Protect? My dear, he will rule Evermere. And you will be nothing more than his consort. A broodmare, to produce his heirs. The words struck Isolde like a slap in the face. She had tried to convince herself that her marriage to Aldrich was a strategic alliance, a necessary sacrifice. But Alara's words exposed the raw truth, the vulnerability of her position. I am not afraid of him, Isolde said, her voice trembling slightly. Alara's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. Perhaps you should be. He is not a man to be trifled with. He has a reputation, a darkness about him. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. They say he killed his first wife, that she died under mysterious circumstances. Isolde felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about Aldrich's past, but she had dismissed them as idle gossip, the product of fear and envy. Now, hearing them from Alara's lips, they seemed all too real. That is a lie, Isolde said, her voice shaking. Alara shrugged, her expression unreadable. Perhaps. But rumors often have a grain of truth. Be careful, Isolde. You have entered a dangerous game, and you may find that you are playing against a master. She turned and walked away, her silken gown rustling against the fallen leaves. Isolde stood there, frozen, her mind reeling. Alara's words had planted a seed of doubt, a seed of fear, that she could not ignore. She looked up at the castle, its gray stone walls seeming to loom over her, menacing and oppressive. She had thought that by marrying Aldrich, she would be securing Evermere's safety. But now, she wondered if she had simply invited a serpent into the garden, a serpent that would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. The beauty of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a chilling premonition of danger. She felt utterly alone, trapped in a web of intrigue and betrayal. Chapter 6. The Weight of a Knight's Oath. The wedding was a somber affair, conducted in the castle chapel with a stark simplicity that reflected the unusual circumstances of the union. There were no lavish decorations, no joyous celebrations, no throngs of well-wishers. Only a handful of witnesses, their faces grim and uncertain, and the cold, imposing presence of Sir Aldrich Blackwell. Isolde wore a gown of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread, a stark contrast to the traditional white of a bride. The fabric felt heavy and constricting, a symbol of the weight of the vows she was about to take. She had insisted on the color, a subtle act of defiance against the circumstances that had forced her into this marriage. Her auburn hair was braided and adorned with a simple silver circlet, a gift from her father, his one attempt at offering some semblance of normalcy to the proceedings. Lord Edmund stood beside her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He gave her away with a trembling hand, his voice barely a whisper as he pronounced the words that would bind his daughter to the Iron Wolf. Aldrich, clad in black as always, stood tall and unyielding, his expression unreadable. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, his words devoid of any emotion. He placed a heavy gold ring on Isolde's finger, its weight a constant reminder of the pact they had made. The ring was plain, unadorned, save for the snarling wolf's head sigil, a symbol of his house and his power. The ceremony was brief and to the point, lacking any warmth or joy. The priest's words seemed to echo in the empty chapel, a hollow pronouncement of a union forged not in love, but in necessity. Isolde felt a sense of detachment, as if she were watching the events unfold from a distance, a spectator in her own life. After the ceremony, there was a small, subdued feast in the great hall. The tables were laden with food, but the atmosphere was strained and uncomfortable. The guests spoke in hushed tones, their conversations punctuated by long, awkward silences. Lord Edmund barely touched his food, his gaze fixed on Isolde, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. Aldrich sat beside Isolde, his presence dominating the table. He ate sparingly, his gaze constantly scanning the room, as if he were assessing the loyalty of everyone present. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were directed primarily at his own men, the small contingent of knights who had accompanied him to Evermere. Isolde found herself observing him, trying to understand the man she had married. She wondered about his thoughts, his feelings, the burdens he carried. She wondered about the oath he had sworn, the oath that had bound him to protect her father, and now to her. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed in her chamber, which was now also Aldrich's, she felt a growing sense of apprehension. She had shared a room with her husband, but the vast space and his silent presence felt more isolating than comforting. Aldrich entered the chamber, his movements quiet and deliberate. He removed his heavy tunic, revealing the broad expanse of his chest, crisscrossed with scars, a testament to his life as a warrior. He did not speak, did not look at her, as he prepared for bed. Isolde watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was the moment, the consummation of their marriage, the final seal on their pact. But she felt no desire, only a deep-seated fear. He turned to her, his gray eyes meeting hers. He saw the fear in her eyes, the hesitation in her posture. He stopped, his expression softening slightly, a flicker of something that might have been understanding. "You are afraid," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question. Isolde nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He took a step closer, but did not touch her. "I will not force you, Isolde," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I swore an oath to protect you, and that includes protecting you from myself." The words surprised her. She had expected him to be cold, demanding, even brutal. But this was unexpected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He inclined his head slightly. "We have time," he said. "Time to understand each other. Time to build trust." He turned away, extinguishing the candles, leaving only the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. He lay down on the bed, his back to her, leaving a vast space between them. Isolde lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had expected a monster, but she had found something else. Something more complex, more human. She realized that Aldrich, too, carried a burden, the weight of his own past, his own oaths. And as she listened to his even breathing in the darkness, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage might not be the prison she had feared. The weight of the knight's oath, she realized, was a burden shared, a responsibility that bound them together in ways she had not yet fully understood. The silence of the room felt less oppressive, replaced by a tentative, shared space. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The following weeks settled into a strange, uneasy routine. Aldrich took control of Evermere's defenses, strengthening the fortifications, training the guards, and establishing a strict, almost martial, law. He was a demanding master, but also a fair one, earning the grudging respect of the castle's inhabitants. He spent his days overseeing the castle's operations, his evenings poring over maps and documents, and his nights in the shared chamber with Isolde, a silent, watchful presence. Isolde, meanwhile, found herself navigating a delicate balance between her role as the lady of the castle and her position as Aldrich's wife. She oversaw the household, managed the servants, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy amidst the upheaval. She also tried to learn more about her husband, to understand the man behind the mask of the Iron Wolf. She began to observe him more closely, noticing the small details that others might miss. The way he clenched his jaw when he was deep in thought, the way his eyes softened when he looked at his warhorse, a magnificent black stallion named Shadow, the way he unconsciously touched the scar on his face when he was troubled. One afternoon, she found him in the stables, tending to Shadow. He was brushing the horse's coat, his movements slow and deliberate, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to the animal. Isolde watched him from a distance, struck by the tenderness he displayed towards the creature, a tenderness she had never seen him show to any human. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. He turned, his expression guarded, as if he were surprised to see her there. "He is a beautiful animal," Isolde said, her voice soft. Aldrich nodded, his gaze returning to Shadow. "He is my most loyal companion," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Isolde hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I have heard stories," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About your past. About your first wife." He stiffened, his hand ceasing its movement on Shadow's flank. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "What have you heard?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Isolde met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. "I have heard that she died under mysterious circumstances," she said, her voice steady. "That you killed her." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Aldrich's eyes flashed with anger, his hand instinctively moving towards the hilt of his sword, which he always wore, even within the castle walls. "Who told you this?" he demanded, his voice tight with rage. "It does not matter," Isolde said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need to know the truth." He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. She could see the battle raging within him, the conflict between his anger and something else. Something that looked like pain. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "She died in childbirth," he said, his voice raw with emotion. It was a difficult birth. The child did not survive. Neither did she. Isolde felt a wave of sympathy wash over her. She had expected denial, anger, perhaps even violence. But this was unexpected. She saw the grief in his eyes, the raw pain that he had carried with him for so long. "I am sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I did not know." He turned away, his shoulders slumping. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice barely audible. "But the scars remain." He reached up and touched the scar on his face, his fingers tracing its jagged outline. Isolde realized that the scar was not just a physical reminder of a battle wound, but also a symbol of his emotional scars, the wounds that time had not healed. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched slightly at her touch, as if he were not used to human contact. But he did not pull away. "I understand," she said, her voice gentle. "I have scars too. We all do." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. He saw the empathy in her eyes, the understanding, the shared pain. For the first time since she had met him, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man beneath the armor. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The silence that stretched between them was filled with a shared understanding, a connection that transcended words. Isolde realized that they were both wounded souls, carrying the burdens of their past. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that perhaps, together, they could find a way to heal. The scars of the past, she realized, were not just marks of pain, but also symbols of resilience, of survival. And perhaps they could be the foundation of something new, something stronger. The air in the stable seemed to lighten, the shared sorrow a tentative bridge between them. Chapter 8. The Tournament of Shadows. King Theodore, in a gesture that was both politically astute and deeply unsettling, announced a grand tournament to be held at Evermere, ostensibly to celebrate the union of House Blackwell and House Evermere. The news sent a ripple of unease through the castle. While tournaments were common occurrences in medieval life, serving as displays of skill, strength, and chivalry, this one felt different. It felt like a test, a challenge, a way for the king to assert his dominance over Aldrich and to gauge the loyalty of his vassals. Aldrich, unsurprisingly, viewed the tournament with a cynical eye. He knew that it was a thinly veiled attempt by the king to assess his strength and to remind him of his place within the hierarchy of power. However, he also recognized the opportunity it presented. A strong showing at the tournament would solidify his position, both within Evermere and within the wider kingdom. It would also send a message to his enemies, a warning that he was not to be trifled with. Isolde, on the other hand, saw the tournament as a chance to bring some much-needed levity and excitement to Evermere. She hoped that it would help to ease the tensions that had gripped the castle since her betrothal and to foster a sense of unity among its people. She also saw it as an opportunity to observe the courtly dynamics, to identify potential allies and enemies, and to learn more about the intricate web of power that governed their lives. Preparations for the tournament began immediately. The castle grounds were transformed into a vibrant spectacle of color and activity. Banners bearing the sigils of the various noble houses fluttered in the breeze. Tents were erected for the knights and their retinues. A grandstand was built for the spectators, overlooking the jousting field. The air was filled with the sounds of hammering, sawing, and the excited chatter of the castle folk. Isolde threw herself into the preparations, overseeing the decorations, the food, and the accommodations for the guests. She worked tirelessly, her efforts driven by a desire to make the tournament a success, both for Evermere and for Aldrich. She also found a sense of purpose in the work, a distraction from the anxieties that plagued her. Aldrich, meanwhile, spent his days training for the tournament. He practiced jousting, sword fighting, and archery, honing his skills to a razor's edge. He was a formidable warrior, his movements precise and powerful, his focus unwavering. Isolde often watched him from afar, admiring his strength and his dedication. One evening, as she was walking through the training yard, she saw him practicing with his sword. He was fighting against 3 of his men, his movements fluid and deadly. He disarmed them quickly, his blade a blur of silver in the fading light. He turned and saw her watching him. He lowered his sword, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. "You are very skilled," Isolde said, her voice filled with admiration. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It is a necessary skill in my profession," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But it is more than just skill," Isolde insisted. "It is art." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He was not used to praise, especially not from her. "I have never thought of it that way," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You move with such grace," Isolde continued. "Such power. It is mesmerizing." He did not reply, but she saw a faint flush rise on his cheeks. He was clearly uncomfortable with her compliments, but also pleased. "Will you win?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He met her gaze directly. "I intend to," he said, his voice firm. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I believe you will," she said. He returned her smile, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed his face, making him look almost handsome. The day of the tournament dawned bright and clear. The castle grounds were filled with a throng of people, nobles and commoners alike, all eager to witness the spectacle. The air was thick with anticipation, the sounds of trumpets and drums filling the air. Isolde, dressed in a gown of emerald green, the color of Evermere, sat in the grandstand beside her father and Aldrich. Lord Edmund remained sullen and withdrawn, his presence a constant reminder of the tension that still existed between him and Aldrich. Aldrich, clad in full plate armor, his helmet bearing the snarling wolf's head sigil, looked every inch the formidable warrior. He sat tall and straight, his gaze fixed on the jousting field, his expression unreadable. The tournament began with a series of justs, knights charging at each other with lances, the clash of steel echoing through the arena. Aldrich participated in several justs, unseating his opponents with ease. He was a force to be reckoned with, his skill and strength undeniable. But as the tournament progressed, Isolde noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. There was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of something unseen. She saw whispered conversations, furtive glances, and veiled threats. She realized that the tournament was not just a display of skill, but also a stage for political maneuvering, a battleground for hidden agendas. She saw Lady Alara of Lormont, her eyes gleaming with malice, whispering in the ear of Lord Varys, a powerful nobleman known for his ambition and his ruthlessness. She saw other nobles, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying their suspicion and their envy. She realized that Aldrich had enemies, many enemies, who would stop at nothing to see him fall. And as the tournament reached its climax, she felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition of danger. The shadows of the tournament, she realized, were not just the shadows of the setting sun, but the shadows of betrayal and treachery. The cheers of the crowd felt hollow, masking a deeper, more sinister game being played out before her eyes. Chapter 9. A Glimpse of Tenderness. The final event of the tournament was a melee, a chaotic free-for-all where multiple knights fought simultaneously. The last man standing declared the victor. It was a brutal and dangerous contest, a test of not only skill but also of endurance and cunning. Aldrich, despite Isolde's unspoken anxieties, entered the melee with his usual stoic determination. Isolde watched from the grandstand, her heart pounding in her chest. The melee was a whirlwind of clashing steel, shouting men, and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. It was difficult to follow the action, to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. She saw Aldrich, his black armor a stark contrast to the brightly colored surcoats of the other knights, fighting with a fierce intensity. He moved with a deadly grace, his sword a blur of silver, deflecting blows, parrying thrusts, and striking down opponents with ruthless efficiency. But she also saw the danger, the constant threat of injury or even death. She saw knights fall, their armor dented and broken, their bodies limp and unmoving. She saw the glint of malice in the eyes of some of Aldrich's opponents, their attacks aimed not just at victory, but at inflicting serious harm. At one point, She saw Aldrich surrounded by 3 knights, their swords raised, their faces grim. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, fearing the worst. But Aldrich, with a combination of skill and brute strength, managed to fight them off, disarming 2 of them and forcing the 3rd to retreat. The melee continued for what seemed like an eternity, the number of combatants gradually dwindling. Finally, only Aldrich and 1 other knight remained, Lord Varys, the ambitious nobleman Isolde had seen conspiring with Lady Alara. Varys was a skilled warrior, known for his ruthlessness and his cunning. He was also a known enemy of Aldrich, a man who coveted his power and his position. The 2 men circled each other, their swords locked, their faces inches apart. They were both exhausted, their armor battered and dented, their breathing ragged. The crowd was silent, holding its breath, anticipating the final clash. Varys lunged, his sword aimed at Aldrich's throat. Aldrich parried the blow, the force of the impact sending a jolt up his arm. He retaliated with a swift thrust, his sword piercing Varys' armor, drawing blood. Varys staggered back, his face contorted in pain and anger. He raised his sword again, but Aldrich was too quick. He disarmed Varys with a swift, precise movement, his sword pointing at the fallen knight's throat. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the arena. Aldrich had won. He had proven his strength, his skill, and his dominance. But Isolde saw something else in his eyes, something that went beyond mere victory. She saw a flicker of relief, a glimpse of the vulnerability he usually kept hidden beneath his stoic exterior. He lowered his sword, offering his hand to Varys to help him up. Varys hesitated for a moment, then accepted the gesture, his face a mask of grudging respect. Aldrich turned towards the grandstand, his gaze meeting Isolde's. He gave her a slight nod, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence, her support. And in that moment, she saw a hint of something else in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. A glimpse of tenderness. Later that evening, after the celebrations had died down, Isolde found Aldrich in his chamber, removing his armor. He was covered in bruises and cuts, his body aching from the brutal contest. She approached him cautiously, her heart filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You were magnificent," she said, her voice soft. He grunted, his expression unreadable. "It was a necessary victory," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But you were also merciful," Isolde continued. "You could have killed Varys, but you did not." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "He is a defeated opponent," he said. "There was no need to kill him." "But he is also your enemy," Isolde insisted. "He would have killed you, given the chance." He shrugged, his broad shoulders moving slightly beneath his tunic. "Perhaps. But I am not him." Isolde felt a surge of warmth towards him, a feeling that went beyond mere respect. She saw the honor in him, the integrity, the refusal to stoop to the level of his enemies. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers gently tracing the outline of a bruise. He flinched slightly at her touch, but he did not pull away. "You are hurt," she said, her voice filled with concern. "It is nothing," he said, dismissing her concern. "Let me help you," she said, her voice firm. She fetched a basin of water and a cloth, and began to gently clean his wounds. He sat silently, allowing her to tend to him, his gaze fixed on her face. As she worked, she felt a strange intimacy between them, a connection that went beyond words. She felt the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the strength of his muscles, the vulnerability of his wounds. "Why did you spare him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Because killing him would have made me no better than him," he said. "Because there is already too much bloodshed in this world." His words resonated with her, confirming what she had already sensed in him. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also a man of principle, a man who valued honor and integrity above all else. She met his gaze and smiled. A real, honest smile. "Thank you." His brow furrowed slightly, but it was the closest to a returned smile Isolde had seen. It was enough. The small, shared moment of tenderness lingered, a fragile bridge built between them amidst the wreckage of the day's battles. The air in the chamber felt lighter, the weight of the tournament lifted, replaced by a tentative, unspoken connection. Chapter 10. The Lioness of Lormont. The aftermath of the tournament brought a deceptive calm to Evermere. The visiting nobles departed, their congratulations to Aldrich laced with varying degrees of sincerity and envy. The castle returned to its usual routine, but the undercurrent of tension remained, a subtle reminder of the political machinations that simmered beneath the surface. Isolde found herself increasingly drawn to Aldrich, her initial fear replaced by a growing respect and something more. She saw the strength in him, the honor, the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. She also saw the loneliness he carried, the isolation of a man who had lived his life in the shadow of war and betrayal. She tried to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that still existed between them. She engaged him in conversations, seeking his opinions on matters of the castle and the kingdom. She shared her own thoughts and feelings, hoping to create a sense of connection, of partnership. Aldrich, however, remained guarded, his emotions carefully controlled. He responded to her overtures with a formal courtesy, but he rarely initiated any conversation, rarely revealed any hint of his inner self. He was like a fortress, his walls impenetrable, his defenses unyielding. One evening, as they were dining together in the great hall, Isolde decided to confront him directly. "Aldrich," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Why do you keep me at arm's length? We are married. We should be closer." He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "Closeness is a weakness," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "A vulnerability I cannot afford." "But we are allies," Isolde insisted. "We should be able to trust each other." He shrugged, his broad shoulders moving slightly beneath his tunic. "Trust is a luxury," he said. "In my world, it is often misplaced." "But I am not your enemy," Isolde said, her voice pleading. "I am your wife." He met her gaze directly, his eyes searching hers. "You are the daughter of a man I spared," he said. "The price of a bargain. That does not automatically equate to trust." His words stung, a sharp reminder of the circumstances that had brought them together. But Isolde refused to be deterred. "I know that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I want to earn your trust. I want us to be more than just a bargain." He did not reply, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of doubt? Or perhaps it was simply her imagination. Before she could press him further, a servant entered the hall, announcing the arrival of an unexpected guest, Lady Alara of Lormont. Isolde felt a surge of unease. She had not seen Alara since their encounter in the garden, since the woman had planted those seeds of doubt about Aldrich's past. She wondered what had brought her back to Evermere, what her true intentions were. Alara entered the hall, her beauty as striking as ever, her smile as false. She greeted Aldrich with a graceful curtsy, her eyes lingering on him with a possessive gleam. "Sir Aldrich," she said, her voice smooth and seductive. "It is a pleasure to see you again. And you, Lady Isolde. Such a fortunate match." Isolde forced a smile, her instincts screaming at her to be wary. "Lady Alara," she greeted her, her voice carefully neutral. "What brings you to Evermere?" Alara's smile widened, revealing a hint of cruelty. "I came to offer my congratulations, of course, and to renew my acquaintance with Sir Aldrich. We have much to discuss." She turned to Aldrich, her gaze lingering on him with an intensity that made Isolde's blood boil. "I hear you have made quite an impression on the king," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He is intrigued by you." Aldrich remained impassive, his expression unreadable. "The king's favor is a fickle thing," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Alara laughed softly, a sound that sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. "Indeed. But it is a prize worth fighting for, and I am always willing to assist those who seek it." She placed her hand on Aldrich's arm, her fingers lingering on his sleeve. Isolde felt a surge of jealousy, a possessiveness she had not realized she possessed. "I am sure Sir Aldrich is capable of managing his own affairs," Isolde said, her voice tight with anger. Alara turned to her, her eyes narrowing, her smile fading. Of course, my dear. But a little guidance never hurts. Especially in the treacherous waters of the royal court. She turned back to Aldrich, her gaze locking with his. I have connections, Sir Aldrich. Influence. I can help you achieve your ambitions. Aldrich met her gaze directly, his expression unreadable. I have no ambitions beyond serving my king and protecting my lands, he said, his voice firm. Alara's smile returned, but it did not reach her eyes. Such modesty. But I see the fire in you, Sir Aldrich. The hunger for power. Do not deny it. Isolde had had enough. She stood up, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Lady Alara, she said, her voice ringing with authority. I believe it is time for you to leave. Alara's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with anger. You dare to dismiss me? She hissed. This is my home, Isolde said, her voice unwavering. And you are no longer welcome here. Alara's face contorted with rage. She looked at Aldrich, expecting him to intervene, to defend her. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Isolde. Alara turned and stormed out of the hall, her silken gown rustling angrily. Isolde stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling. She had confronted the lioness of Lormont, and she had won. But as she looked at Aldrich, she saw not admiration, but a flicker of concern. You have made an enemy, he said, his voice low. She was already my enemy, Isolde replied, her voice firm. And I will not allow her to poison our home with her lies and her manipulations. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers. Then, for the first time, he offered her a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. It was a brief, fleeting expression, but it was enough. The lioness, Isolde realized, had found her own roar, and she would not hesitate to use it to protect what was hers. The air in the hall felt clearer, the tension broken, replaced by a newfound sense of defiance and solidarity. Chapter 11. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The weeks following Alara's expulsion were marked by a growing unease. Isolde found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, sensing eyes upon her, feeling the weight of unseen threats. Aldrich, too, seemed more guarded, his vigilance heightened. He doubled the patrols around the castle, tightened security, and spent hours in his study, poring over maps and documents, his face etched with worry. Isolde tried to break through his defenses, to understand what was troubling him. But he remained closed off, his emotions carefully concealed. He offered only vague reassurances, telling her that he was taking precautions, that everything was under control. One cold, gray morning, a messenger arrived from the royal court, bearing a sealed letter for Aldrich. Isolde watched as he read the letter, his face paling with each line. He crumpled the parchment in his fist, his knuckles turning white. What is it? Isolde asked, her voice filled with apprehension. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. The king has summoned me to court, he said, his voice a low growl. He accuses me of treason. Isolde gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Treason? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. But that is impossible. You are loyal to the king. Aldrich shook his head, his expression grim. Loyalty means nothing in the royal court, he said. It is a viper's nest of ambition and betrayal. Someone has poisoned the king's mind against me. Who? Isolde asked, her voice trembling. Who would do this? He met her gaze directly, his eyes filled with suspicion. I do not know, he said. But I intend to find out. He turned and strode towards the door, his movements swift and decisive. I must leave immediately, he said. The king demands my presence. Isolde felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew that this was a trap, a dangerous game orchestrated by his enemies. She feared for his safety, for his life. Do not go, she pleaded, her voice desperate. It is too dangerous. They will kill you. He stopped at the door, his hand on the latch. He turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. I have no choice, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. I must face these accusations. I must clear my name. But you are walking into a trap, Isolde insisted. They will not give you a fair trial. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. It was a brief, fleeting gesture, but it sent a shiver down her spine. I am not afraid, he said, his voice low. I have faced death many times before. But I am afraid, Isolde whispered, her voice trembling. I am afraid of losing you. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of the emotions he usually kept hidden. He did not speak, but he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was a chaste, almost brotherly gesture, but it was filled with a tenderness that surprised her. Then, he turned and left, disappearing through the doorway, leaving Isolde alone with her fears and her anxieties. The following days were agonizing. Isolde waited for news, her heart pounding with every creak of the castle gates, every approaching footstep. She paced the floor, her mind racing, imagining the worst possible scenarios. She tried to distract herself with her duties, overseeing the household, managing the servants, but her thoughts were constantly with Aldrich, wondering what was happening to him at the royal court. Finally, a messenger arrived, bearing another sealed letter. Isolde tore it open, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter was not from Aldrich. It was from Lord Varys. She read the words, her blood turning to ice. Varys wrote that Aldrich had been found guilty of treason, that he had been imprisoned, and that he was to be executed at dawn. Isolde crumpled the letter in her fist, a sob escaping her lips. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a grief so profound that it threatened to consume her. She had been betrayed. Aldrich had been betrayed. And now he was going to die. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She had lost him. She had lost everything. But then, a flicker of anger ignited within her, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She would not give up. She would not let them win. She stood up, her tears drying on her cheeks, her eyes hardening with resolve. She would find a way to save him. She would fight for him, even if it meant risking her own life. She knew that she had few allies, that she was surrounded by enemies. But she also knew that she had one weapon, one advantage that they did not expect: her courage. She would go to the royal court. She would confront the king. She would expose the lies and the manipulations that had led to Aldrich's condemnation. She would not rest until she had secured his freedom, until she had brought him home. Betrayal's bitter sting had wounded her deeply, but it had also awakened a strength within her, a fierce determination that would not be denied. The game, she realized, was far from over, and she was ready to play. The weight of the impending loss fueled her, transforming her grief into a burning resolve. Chapter 12. Flight into the Mists. Isolde knew that traveling to the royal court openly would be a fool's errand. She would be arrested immediately, her pleas for Aldrich dismissed as the ravings of a desperate wife. She needed a plan, a way to infiltrate the court undetected, to gather evidence, to find allies who might be willing to help her. She decided to disguise herself as a servant, a humble, unassuming figure who could blend into the background, observe and listen. She donned a simple, coarse woolen dress, stained her hands and face with dirt, and bound her auburn hair tightly beneath a plain linen cap. She practiced a humble, subservient demeanor, lowering her gaze, speaking softly, and avoiding any attention. She chose a small, sturdy horse, one that would not draw attention, and packed a meager supply of food and water. She also took with her a small, sharp dagger, concealed beneath her cloak, a weapon for self-defense, if necessary. She slipped out of Evermere in the dead of night, avoiding the guards, her heart pounding with every creak of the saddle, every rustle of leaves. She rode under the cover of darkness, choosing back roads and hidden paths, avoiding any contact with travelers. The journey was long and arduous, filled with danger and uncertainty. She slept in fields and forests, her body aching, her mind racing. She ate sparingly, her stomach constantly gnawed by hunger and anxiety. She encountered suspicious travelers, wary villagers, and the constant threat of discovery. But she pressed on, driven by her unwavering determination to save Aldrich. She clung to the image of his face, his gray eyes, his rare smile, the memory of his gentle touch. She would not fail him. As she approached the royal city, the landscape became more populated, the roads more crowded. She had to be even more cautious, more vigilant. She mingled with the throngs of people entering the city, her head down, her eyes averted, trying to blend into the anonymity of the crowd. The city was a chaotic maze of narrow streets, bustling markets, and towering buildings. The air was thick with the smells of smoke, sweat, and refuse. The sounds of the city, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of carts, the cries of beggars were overwhelming. Isolde found a small, dingy inn in a less reputable part of the city, a place where she could stay unnoticed, a place where questions were rarely asked. She paid for a small, cramped room, barely larger than a closet, and settled in, trying to formulate a plan. She knew that she had to find a way to get into the royal castle, to get close to the king, to uncover the truth about Aldrich's condemnation. But she also knew that it would be incredibly dangerous, that one wrong move could lead to her capture, her imprisonment, or even her death. She spent the next few days exploring the city, observing the comings and goings of the royal castle, gathering information, listening to gossip. She learned that the king was increasingly paranoid, that he was surrounded by sycophants and flatterers, that he trusted no one. She also learned that Lady Alara of Lormont had become a close confidant of the king, that she had his ear, that she was wielding considerable influence. Isolde's suspicions about Alara deepened. She was convinced that the woman was behind Aldrich's downfall, that she had manipulated the king, that she had orchestrated the entire plot. But she needed proof, evidence that she could present to someone. But who? One evening, as she was returning to her inn, she noticed a group of men gathered in a dark alley, their voices hushed, their movements furtive. She recognized one of them as a knight she had seen at Evermere, a man who had served under Aldrich, a man known for his loyalty. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a risk, a dangerous gamble. But she had no other choice. She approached them cautiously, her head down, her voice soft. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I overheard you talking about Sir Aldrich." The men turned to face her, their expressions suspicious, their hands instinctively moving towards their swords.
"Who are you?"
one of them demanded, his voice harsh. Isolde took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. "I am a friend," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "A friend of Sir Aldrich. I know he has been falsely accused. I am trying to help him." The men exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. They were wary, uncertain, unsure whether to trust her.
"How do we know you are not a spy?"
Another man asked, his voice threatening. Isolde met their gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated.
"You don't," she said.
"But I am risking my life by coming here. I am asking for your help." The knight she recognized, a man named Sir Gareth, stepped forward. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "What do you know?" he asked, his voice low. Isolde told them everything she knew, about Alara's machinations, about Varys' letter, about her suspicions. She spoke with passion, with conviction, her voice filled with a desperate plea for help. Gareth listened intently, his expression hardening with each word. "I always knew there was something foul about this," he said, his voice filled with anger. "Aldrich is a good man. He would never betray the king." He turned to the other men. "We cannot stand idly by while an innocent man is executed," he said. "We must do something." The men nodded in agreement, their faces grim with determination. They had made a decision. They would help her. Isolde felt a surge of hope, a flicker of relief in the darkness. She was not alone. She had found allies, men who were willing to risk their lives to fight for justice.
"We need a plan," Gareth said.
"A way to get you into the castle, a way to expose the truth." As they huddled together in the misty alley, Formulating their desperate plan, Isolde felt a renewed sense of determination. The flight into the mists had been perilous, but it had also led her to a glimmer of hope, a chance to save the man she had come to care for. The odds were still stacked against them, but they would face them together, united by their loyalty to Aldrich and their belief in justice. Chapter 13. The Sanctuary of the Silent Sisters. Gareth's plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. He proposed that Isolde seek refuge and assistance at a secluded monastery known as the Sanctuary of the Silent Sisters, located just outside the city walls. The sisters were a reclusive order, renowned for their piety, their healing skills, and their strict vow of silence. They were also known for their independence, their refusal to bow to any earthly authority, including the king. Gareth believed that the sisters, with their network of contacts and their reputation for impartiality, might be able to provide Isolde with a safe haven and potentially help her gather evidence against Alara and Varys. He also revealed a crucial piece of information. The abbess of the Silent Sisters, Mother Agnes, was Aldrich's aunt, his mother's sister. This familial connection, though shrouded in secrecy, might offer a glimmer of hope. Isolde, initially hesitant about involving a religious order, especially one known for its silence, eventually agreed. She had few other options, and Gareth's unwavering faith in the sisters convinced her to take the risk. Under the cover of darkness, Gareth escorted Isolde to the outskirts of the city, guiding her through hidden paths and back alleys. The air was thick with mist, obscuring their movements, making them feel like shadows slipping through the night. They reached the monastery gates, a pair of massive, iron-bound doors set into a high stone wall. Gareth knocked 3 times, a specific pattern he had learned from a trusted contact. A small wicket gate opened, revealing the face of a young nun, her features obscured by the shadows of her wimple. Gareth spoke in a low voice, explaining Isolde's situation, her connection to Aldrich, and her desperate need for sanctuary. The nun listened intently, her eyes fixed on Isolde, assessing her, judging her sincerity. After a long, tense silence, the nun nodded and opened the wicket gate, gesturing for Isolde to enter. Gareth gave Isolde a reassuring nod, his hand squeezing hers briefly. "Be careful," he whispered, "and may the gods be with you." Isolde stepped through the gate, leaving Gareth behind, entering a world of silence and mystery. The nun closed the gate behind her, the sound echoing in the stillness. The monastery was a stark contrast to the chaos and noise of the city. It was a place of quiet contemplation, of serene beauty, of profound peace. The buildings were made of gray stone, simple and unadorned, but they possessed a certain elegance, a sense of timeless grace. The nun led Isolde through a series of courtyards and cloisters, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floors. The air was filled with the scent of incense and herbs. The only sounds were the rustle of their robes and the distant chirping of birds. They reached a small, sparsely furnished chamber, the abbess's office. The nun gestured for Isolde to wait, then disappeared through a doorway. Isolde stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mixture of fear and anticipation, of hope and uncertainty. She was about to meet Aldrich's aunt, a woman who held the key to his past and perhaps to his future. After a few minutes, the nun returned, followed by an older woman, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. This was Mother Agnes, the abbess of the Silent Sisters. The abbess studied Isolde for a long moment, her gaze piercing. She did not speak, of course, but her eyes conveyed a mixture of curiosity, concern, and recognition. Isolde knelt before her, bowing her head in respect. She knew that she had to earn this woman's trust, to convince her of her sincerity. Using a combination of gestures, facial expressions, and a few whispered words when they were out of earshot of the other nuns, Isolde explained her situation, her marriage to Aldrich, his false accusation, her desperate quest to save him. The abbess listened intently, her expression unchanging. She occasionally nodded or shook her head, indicating her understanding or her questions. After Isolde had finished her story, the abbess remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Isolde's face. Then, she reached out and took Isolde's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She led Isolde to a small table, where a piece of parchment and a quill lay. She gestured for Isolde to write down everything she knew, every detail, every suspicion, every piece of evidence. Isolde did as she was instructed, her hand trembling as she wrote. She poured out her heart on the parchment, revealing her fears, her hopes, her love for Aldrich. When she was finished, she handed the parchment to the abbess. The abbess read it carefully, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening. Then, she looked at Isolde, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a small, fleeting smile, but it was filled with warmth and hope. She took Isolde's hand again and led her to another chamber, a larger, more comfortable room, with a bed, a table, and a small window overlooking a peaceful garden. This, she indicated, would be Isolde's sanctuary, her refuge, her place of safety. The abbess then gestured towards a small, hidden door in the wall. She opened it, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into darkness. This, she indicated, was a secret passage, a way out of the monastery, a path to freedom. Isolde understood. The Silent Sisters would help her. They would protect her. And they would help her save Aldrich. She felt a surge of gratitude, a wave of relief wash over her. She was not alone. She had found sanctuary, and she had found hope in the most unexpected of places. The silence of the monastery, she realized, was not a sign of indifference, but a source of strength, a shield against the chaos and treachery of the outside world. The Silent Sisters, bound by their vow, were also bound by a deeper loyalty, a commitment to justice and to family. Chapter 14. Echoes of a Forgotten Love. Life within the sanctuary of the Silent Sisters was a stark contrast to the turmoil Isolde had experienced in the outside world. The days were structured around a rigid schedule of prayer, meditation, and work. The sisters moved with a quiet grace, their silence creating an atmosphere of profound peace. Isolde, though initially unnerved by the lack of spoken communication, gradually adapted to the rhythm of the monastery. She found solace in the silence, in the opportunity to reflect, to gather her thoughts, to plan her next move. She learned to communicate with the sisters through gestures, facial expressions, and written notes. She discovered that silence could be a powerful form of communication, that it could convey emotions and intentions more effectively than words. Mother Agnes, Aldrich's aunt, proved to be a valuable ally. Though bound by her vow of silence, she was a shrewd and resourceful woman, with a network of contacts that extended far beyond the monastery walls. She communicated with Isolde primarily through written notes, her handwriting elegant and precise, her words carefully chosen. Through their silent exchanges, Isolde learned more about Aldrich's past, about his childhood, his family, his first wife. Mother Agnes revealed that Aldrich's mother, a gentle and kind woman, had died when he was young, leaving him in the care of his father, a stern and demanding warrior. Aldrich had been raised to be a soldier, trained from an early age in the arts of war. He had excelled in his training, becoming a formidable knight, but he had also developed a deep-seated sense of loneliness, a fear of emotional attachment. His first marriage, to a woman named Lyra, had been arranged by his father. Lyra was beautiful and kind, but Aldrich had never truly loved her. Their marriage had been brief and tragic, ending with Lyra's death in childbirth. Aldrich had blamed himself for her death, carrying the burden of guilt and grief for years. Isolde felt a pang of sympathy for Aldrich, understanding the pain he had endured, the scars he carried. She realized that his cold, aloof demeanor was a defense mechanism, a way to protect himself from further emotional pain. Mother Agnes also revealed that Alara of Lormont had been a childhood acquaintance of Aldrich's, that she had always been infatuated with him, that she had been jealous of Lyra. She had tried to seduce Aldrich after Lyra's death, but he had rejected her advances, earning her undying enmity. Isolde's suspicions about Alara were confirmed. She was convinced that the woman was behind Aldrich's downfall, that she had manipulated the king, that she had orchestrated the entire plot out of spite and a twisted desire for revenge. Mother Agnes, through her network of contacts, began to gather evidence against Alara and Varys. She discovered that they had been secretly communicating with enemies of the king, that they had been plotting to overthrow him and seize power for themselves. Aldrich, she learned, had stumbled upon their plot and had been about to expose them when he was arrested. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to raise serious doubts about Aldrich's guilt. Mother Agnes believed that if they could present this evidence to the right people, to influential nobles who were not under Alara's sway, they might be able to sway public opinion and force the king to reconsider his decision. But time was running out. Aldrich's execution was scheduled for the following dawn. They had to act quickly. Mother Agnes arranged for Isolde to meet with Sir Gareth and a small group of loyal knights in a secret location outside the city walls. They devised a daring plan to rescue Aldrich from prison, a plan that involved stealth, deception, and a considerable amount of risk. Isolde, despite her fear, was determined to go through with it. She would not abandon Aldrich. She would fight for him, even if it meant risking her own life. As she prepared for the rescue mission, she found herself thinking about Aldrich, about the man he was beneath the armor, about the glimpses of tenderness she had seen in him. She realized that she had fallen in love with him, not with the Iron Wolf, the feared warrior, but with the wounded soul, the man of honor, the man who had shown her kindness and respect. She knew that their marriage had been a bargain, a pact made out of necessity. But she hoped that, if they survived this ordeal, they might have a chance to build something real, something based on trust and affection. She clung to that hope, to that dream, as she slipped out of the monastery under the cover of darkness, joining Gareth and his men, ready to face the dangers that lay ahead. The echoes of a forgotten love, both Aldrich's and her own, fueled her courage, giving her the strength to fight for a future that seemed impossibly distant, yet worth every risk. The silence of the monastery had given way to the silent determination of a woman fighting for the man she loved. Chapter 15. The Price of Freedom. The plan to rescue Aldrich was fraught with peril. The royal prison was heavily guarded, a formidable fortress designed to hold the most dangerous criminals. Gareth and his men, though skilled warriors, were vastly outnumbered. They would have to rely on stealth, speed, and the element of surprise. Isolde, disguised as a young boy, her hair tucked beneath a cap, her face smudged with dirt, was to play a crucial role. Her small size and unassuming appearance would allow her to slip through the prison gates unnoticed, carrying a message to Aldrich and a small, concealed file to help him saw through his chains. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the prison, their movements silent and cautious. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant shout of a guard. Isolde felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm, to focus on the task at hand. She thought of Aldrich, imprisoned and awaiting execution, and her resolve hardened. Gareth and his men created a diversion at the main gate, drawing the guards' attention away from a smaller, less conspicuous side entrance. Isolde, taking advantage of the chaos, slipped through the side gate, her heart pounding in her chest. She found herself in a dark, damp corridor, the air heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies and stale urine. The sounds of the prison, the moans of prisoners, the clanking of chains, the gruff voices of guards were terrifying. She moved quickly, following Gareth's instructions, navigating the maze of corridors, avoiding any contact with guards or prisoners. She reached Aldrich's cell, a small, dark, and filthy space, barely large enough for a man to stand. She saw him through the bars, his face pale and drawn, his body bruised and battered, but his eyes still burning with a fierce defiance. "Aldrich," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He did not recognize her at first, her disguise so effective. "Isolde?" he said, his voice barely audible. "Is that you?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I am here," she said. "I am going to get you out." She quickly explained the plan, passing the file and a small, coded message through the bars. He took them, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Be careful," he said, his voice filled with concern. "It is too dangerous." "I am not afraid," she said, her voice firm. "I will not leave you." She turned and slipped away, retracing her steps, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She rejoined Gareth and his men, who were waiting for her outside the prison walls. They had managed to create enough chaos to allow Aldrich a chance to escape, but the alarm had been raised. The prison was now on high alert. As they waited, they heard the sounds of pursuit, the shouts of guards, the baying of hounds. They knew that time was running out. Suddenly, Aldrich emerged from the prison, his chains broken, his face grim with determination. He was wounded, bleeding from a cut on his arm, but he was free. They fled into the night, pursued by the guards, their horses galloping at full speed. The chase was relentless, the sounds of their pursuers growing closer. They reached the edge of the city, where the forest began. They plunged into the darkness, the trees offering them some cover, but also slowing their progress. The guards were gaining on them. They could hear their shouts, their horses' hooves pounding on the ground. Gareth turned to Aldrich and Isolde.
"You must go on," he said.
"We will hold them off." Aldrich protested, unwilling to leave his men behind. But Gareth insisted. "It is the only way," he said. "You must escape. You must live to fight another day." Aldrich hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his face filled with regret. He knew that Gareth was right. He urged his horse forward, Isolde riding beside him, their hands clasped tightly together. They left Gareth and his men behind, listening as the sounds of battle erupted in the distance. They rode for hours, their bodies aching, their minds numb with exhaustion. They did not speak, their silence filled with a mixture of grief, guilt, and a desperate hope for survival. They reached a small, secluded cottage, a safe house arranged by Mother Agnes. They dismounted, their legs stiff and aching, and entered the cottage, seeking refuge from the cold and the darkness. They were safe for now, but they knew that they were still fugitives, that the king's wrath would follow them. Aldrich tended to his wounds, his movements slow and deliberate. Isolde watched him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the sacrifices he had made. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You saved my life." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears. "We saved each other," she said. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers gently tracing the outline of her face. It was a tender gesture, filled with the warmth that she had rarely seen from him. "You are very brave," he said, his voice soft. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "So are you," she said. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was filled with a mixture of gratitude, affection, and something more. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a moment of connection, a moment of hope in the midst of despair. They had paid the price of freedom, a heavy price, but they had paid it together. And in that moment, they knew that they were not alone, that they had each other. The future was uncertain, filled with danger, but they would face it together, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured. The small cottage, a temporary sanctuary, felt like a haven, a place where love and loyalty had triumphed over betrayal and despair. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. The respite at the safe house was brief. Aldrich knew that they could not stay there long, that the king's forces would be searching for them, that they were still in grave danger. He decided that they needed to seek refuge in the north, in his own lands, among his own people, where he could rally support and prepare to fight back against the false accusations. The journey north was arduous and perilous. They traveled in disguise, avoiding main roads, sleeping in forests and fields, constantly on the lookout for the king's patrols. They were fugitives, hunted and alone, relying on their wits and their courage to survive. Isolde, despite her fear, proved to be a resilient and resourceful companion. She had shed her initial timidity, replaced by a fierce determination to survive and to protect Aldrich. She learned to ride like a warrior, to hunt for food, to defend herself with a dagger. She had transformed from a sheltered noblewoman into a woman of strength and courage. Aldrich, too, was changing. The ordeal of his imprisonment and escape had stripped away some of his cold, aloof demeanor, revealing the man beneath the armor. He was still a warrior, still a leader, but he was also more vulnerable, more human. He relied on Isolde's counsel, her intuition, her unwavering support. He treated her not as a pawn in a political game, but as an equal, a partner, a woman he had come to respect and love. Their relationship deepened during their flight. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They talked about their pasts, their families, their beliefs. They learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to love each other. One evening, as they were camped in a secluded forest, Aldrich built a small fire, its warmth a welcome relief from the cold night air. They sat together, wrapped in their cloaks, gazing into the flames. "I never thought I would love again," Aldrich said, his voice low. "After Lyra, I closed myself off. I built walls around my heart." Isolde reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his.
"I understand," she said.
"I, too, have known loss. I have known fear." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a tenderness that she had rarely seen before. "You have broken down those walls, Isolde," he said. "You have shown me that it is possible to love again, to trust again." She smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that defied the cold night air. "And you have shown me that strength is not just about wielding a sword," she said. "It is about vulnerability. It is about love." He leaned down and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that was filled with a depth of emotion that surprised them both. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of a future together, a future they would fight for. As they continued their journey north, they began to encounter small bands of loyal knights and soldiers, men who had served under Aldrich, men who believed in his innocence. They rallied to his side, offering their support, their swords, their lives. The news of Aldrich's escape and his return to the north spread quickly. The people of his lands, who had always respected and admired him, welcomed him back with open arms. They had heard the rumors of his betrayal, but they did not believe them. They knew him to be a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man who would never betray his king. Aldrich began to gather his forces, preparing for a confrontation with the king. He knew that it would be a difficult battle, that he was outnumbered and outgunned. But he also knew that he had right on his side, that he was fighting for justice, for truth, for his freedom. He sent messengers to other noble houses, seeking allies, trying to convince them of his innocence, warning them of Alera's and Varys' treachery. Some responded favorably, offering their support, while others remained hesitant, unwilling to risk the king's wrath. The storm was gathering, the clouds of war darkening the horizon. Aldrich and Isolde stood together, facing the approaching tempest, their love and their loyalty their strongest weapons. They knew that the battle ahead would be long and bloody, that the outcome was uncertain. But they were ready to fight, to defend their honor, their lands, and their love. The fugitive's flight had transformed into a warrior's return, a gathering of forces against a corrupt regime. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. The news of Aldrich's gathering forces reached King Theodore, fueled by the whispers and machinations of Alera and Varys. The king, already paranoid and insecure, flew into a rage, declaring Aldrich a traitor and ordering his immediate capture and execution. He dispatched a large army north, led by Lord Varys, to crush Aldrich's rebellion and bring him back to the capital in chains. Aldrich, anticipating the king's response, had prepared his defenses. He had fortified his castle, Blackwell Keep, and had gathered a sizable force of loyal knights, soldiers, and commoners, all willing to fight for his cause. He knew that he was outnumbered, but he also knew that he had the advantage of fighting on his own ground, defending his own home. Isolde, though trained as a lady of the court, refused to remain idle. She insisted on taking an active role in the defense, organizing supplies, tending to the wounded, and even training with the other women of the castle in the use of bows and arrows. She had become a warrior in her own right, her courage and determination inspiring those around her. The first clash between Aldric's forces and the king's army occurred on a windswept plain outside Blackwell Keep. The battle was fierce and bloody, the air filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the cries of men, and the thunder of hooves. Aldric, leading his troops from the front, fought with a ferocious intensity, his black armor a beacon of defiance amidst the chaos. He was a force to be reckoned with, his sword a blur of silver, cutting down enemies with ruthless efficiency. Isolde, stationed on the castle walls with the other women, watched the battle unfold with a mixture of fear and pride. She saw Aldric's courage, his leadership, his unwavering determination. She also saw the danger, the constant threat of death that hung over him and his men. She and the other women rained arrows down upon the attacking forces, providing covering fire for Aldric's troops. They fought with a desperate courage, defending their home, their families, their freedom. The battle raged for hours, the tide turning back and forth. Aldric's forces, though outnumbered, fought with a fierce determination, inspired by their loyalty to their lord and their belief in his innocence. But the king's army was larger and better equipped. They began to push Aldric's forces back, forcing them to retreat towards the castle walls. Aldric, seeing his men faltering, rallied them with a roar, his voice echoing across the battlefield. He charged into the thick of the fighting, his sword a whirlwind of death, inspiring his troops to fight on. But then, disaster struck. An arrow, fired from the ranks of the king's army, struck Aldric in the shoulder, piercing his armor. He staggered, his sword falling from his grasp, his body slumping to the ground. Isolde screamed, her heart stopping in her chest. She saw him fall, saw the enemy soldiers closing in on him, their swords raised, ready to deliver the final blow. She scrambled down from the castle walls, her bow and arrows forgotten, her only thought to reach Aldric, to protect him. She ran across the battlefield, dodging swords and arrows, her eyes fixed on Aldric's fallen form. She reached him just as the enemy soldiers were about to strike. She threw herself in front of him, shielding his body with her own, her dagger raised in defiance. "No," she cried, her voice ringing with a fierce determination. "You will not touch him." The soldiers hesitated, surprised by her sudden appearance, her unexpected courage. Before they could react, Aldric's loyal knights, seeing their lord fallen and his wife defending him, charged forward, their swords raised, their faces grim with determination. They drove the enemy soldiers back, forming a protective circle around Aldric and Isolde. Isolde knelt beside Aldric, her hands trembling as she examined his wound. The arrow had pierced his shoulder, but it had not struck any vital organs. He was alive, but he was badly injured. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and bound his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Aldric," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please be strong. You must live." He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. He smiled weakly, his face pale and drawn. "Isolde," he whispered, "you saved me again." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We will get through this," she said. Together. The battle continued to rage around them, but for a moment, they were in their own world, their love and their loyalty their only shield against the chaos and the violence. The flames of rebellion, ignited by injustice, had engulfed them, but their love burned brighter, a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. They would not surrender. Chapter 18. The Wolf's Howl. With Aldric wounded, the tide of the battle turned decisively against his forces. They were forced to retreat within the walls of Blackwell Keep, the king's army hot on their heels. The siege began, a brutal and relentless assault on the castle's defenses. Isolde, despite her own exhaustion and fear, tended to Aldric's wound, cleaning it, bandaging it, and praying for his recovery. He was weak and feverish, his body ravaged by the injury and the exertion of the battle. She stayed by his side, day and night, refusing to leave him, even for a moment. The siege continued for days, the king's army pounding the castle walls with catapults and battering rams. The defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate courage, knowing that their lives and the lives of their families depended on their resistance. Food and water began to run low. The wounded multiplied. Hope dwindled. But still, they fought on, inspired by Aldrich's unwavering spirit, even in his weakened state, and by Isolde's fierce determination. One evening, as Isolde sat beside Aldrich's bedside, he opened his eyes, his gaze clear and focused. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Isolde," he said, his voice weak but firm. "We cannot hold out much longer. The castle will fall." She nodded, her heart heavy with grief. She knew that he was right.
"We must escape," he said.
"We must find a way to reach our allies, to rally support, to continue the fight." "But you are too weak to travel," Isolde protested.
He shook his head.
"I will not die in this castle," he said. "I will not surrender to that tyrant king." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a fierce determination.
"There is a secret passage," he said.
"It leads out of the castle, to the forest. It is our only hope." Isolde remembered the secret passage in the sanctuary of the Silent Sisters, the one Mother Agnes had shown her. She realized that Aldrich must have known about it all along, that it was a part of his family's history, a secret passed down through generations.
"I know of it," she said.
"Mother Agnes showed me a similar passage." He nodded.
"We must use it," he said.
Tonight, that night, under the cover of darkness, they prepared for their escape. Isolde gathered a small group of loyal knights and servants, those who were still able to fight, those who were willing to risk their lives to follow their lord. They carried Aldrich on a makeshift stretcher, his body wrapped in blankets, his face pale and drawn. They slipped out of the castle through the secret passage, a narrow, winding tunnel that led beneath the castle walls and into the surrounding forest. The escape was perilous, the passage dark and treacherous. They had to move slowly and cautiously, avoiding any noise that might alert the enemy. They reached the forest, their bodies aching, their hearts pounding. They were free from the castle, but they were still in danger. The king's army was still searching for them, their patrols scouring the countryside. They traveled for days, avoiding roads and villages, hiding in forests and caves, relying on the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of Aldrich's supporters. Aldrich's conditions slowly improved. The fever subsided, his strength returned, his spirit remained unbroken. One evening, as they were camped in a remote valley, they heard the sound of distant horns, the unmistakable signal of approaching allies. A group of knights, bearing the banners of a northern noble house, rode into their camp. They had received Aldrich's message, they had heard of his plight, and they had come to offer their support. More allies followed, knights and soldiers from other noble houses, men who believed in Aldrich's innocence, men who were willing to fight against the king's tyranny. Aldrich's forces began to grow, his strength returning, his hope rekindled. He was no longer a fugitive, hiding in the shadows. He was a leader, rallying his people, preparing for a final confrontation with the king. He stood on a hilltop, overlooking the valley where his army was encamped, his wounded shoulder still bandaged, but his eyes burning with a fierce determination. He raised his voice, his words echoing across the valley, a powerful, defiant roar that sent shivers down the spines of his enemies. "We will fight," he cried. "We will fight for our freedom. We will fight for justice. We will fight for our lands. We will fight for our honor. We will fight for our love." His words were met with a resounding cheer, a roar of defiance that echoed through the mountains, a wolf's howl that signaled the beginning of the final battle. The siege had failed. The escape had succeeded. And now, the true war was about to begin. The wounded wolf, strengthened by love and loyalty, was ready to lead his pack to victory. Chapter 19. A Kingdom's Fate. The final battle took place on the same plain where Aldrich's forces had first clashed with the king's army. But this time, the circumstances were different. Aldrich's army, though still smaller than the king's, was bolstered by the arrival of new allies, their ranks swelled by men and women who believed in his cause, who were willing to fight for justice and freedom. Aldrich, fully recovered from his wound, led his troops from the front, his black armor gleaming in the sunlight, his sword held high. He was a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope, a leader who inspired his followers to fight with a courage and determination that defied the odds. Isolde, no longer a passive observer, rode beside him, clad in leather armor, a sword at her side, her auburn hair flowing in the wind. She had become a warrior, a leader, a woman who would fight for her husband, for her people, for her future. The two armies clashed with a thunderous roar, the sound of steel on steel echoing across the plain. The battle was fierce and bloody, the air thick with the screams of men, the cries of horses, the clash of weapons. Aldrich fought with a ferocious intensity, his sword a blur of silver, cutting down enemies with ruthless efficiency. He was everywhere on the battlefield, rallying his troops, inspiring them to fight on, leading them to victory. Isolde, too, fought with courage and skill, her sword flashing in the sunlight, defending herself and those around her. She had learned to fight like a warrior, to kill like a warrior, but she had not lost her compassion, her empathy, her humanity. The battle raged for hours, the tide turning back and forth. Both sides fought with a desperate courage, knowing that the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. Aldrich's forces, inspired by his leadership and their belief in his cause, began to gain the upper hand. They pushed the king's army back, forcing them to retreat, breaking their lines. Lord Varys, seeing his army faltering, charged towards Aldrich, his sword raised, his face contorted with rage. He was determined to kill Aldrich, to end the rebellion, to secure his own power. But Aldrich was ready for him. He parried Varys' attack, his sword deflecting the blow, his eyes meeting Varys with a cold, hard stare. They fought fiercely, their swords clashing, their bodies straining. Aldrich, fueled by his anger at Varys' treachery and his love for Isolde, fought with a strength and skill that surpassed even his own expectations. He disarmed Varys, his sword pointing at the fallen knight's throat. Varys lay on the ground, defeated, his eyes filled with fear and hatred. Aldrich could have killed him. He could have ended his life with a single stroke. But he hesitated. He looked at Isolde, who was watching him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. He lowered his sword. "I will not kill you," he said, his voice cold and hard. "I will not stoop to your level. You will be judged by the law, not by my sword." Varys was taken prisoner, his treachery exposed, his ambitions shattered. The king's army, seeing their leader captured and their ranks broken, began to surrender. The battle was over. Aldrich had won. The cheers of his troops echoed across the plain, a triumphant roar that celebrated their victory, their freedom, their justice. Aldrich and Isolde embraced, their love and their loyalty their strongest shield against the chaos and the violence. They had faced death, betrayal, and war, and they had emerged victorious, their bond stronger than ever. But the victory was not complete. King Theodore, still consumed by his paranoia and his rage, refused to accept defeat. He had retreated to the royal castle, where he had barricaded himself, surrounded by his remaining loyal guards. Aldrich knew that he had to confront the king, that he had to end his reign of terror, that he had to secure the future of the kingdom. He prepared for a final assault on the royal castle, a desperate and dangerous undertaking. The battle had been won, but the war was not yet over. A kingdom's fate rested on the outcome of this final confrontation, a showdown between a righteous rebel and a tyrannical king. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The assault on the royal castle was swift and decisive. Aldrich's forces, fueled by their victory on the battlefield and their desire for justice, stormed the castle walls, overwhelming the king's remaining guards. The fighting was fierce but brief, the defenders demoralized and outnumbered. Aldrich, leading the charge, fought his way through the castle corridors, his sword clearing a path towards the throne room, where he knew King Theodore was hiding. Isolde, fighting alongside him, matched his courage and determination, her sword skills honed by weeks of relentless battle. They reached the throne room doors, massive and imposing, guarded by the last remnants of the king's royal guard. Aldrich and his men engaged the guards, their swords clashing in a final, desperate struggle. Isolde, seeing an opening, slipped past the fighting and forced open the throne room doors. She found herself face to face with King Theodore, who was cowering on his throne, his eyes wide with fear, his crown askew. He looked at her, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You," he screamed. "You dare to defy me?" Isolde stood tall, her sword raised, her gaze unwavering. "Your reign of terror is over," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You are no longer king." Theodore lunged at her, a dagger in his hand, his movements desperate and clumsy. Isolde easily parried his attack, disarming him with a swift, precise movement. She held her sword to his throat, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. She could have killed him. She could have ended his life with a single stroke. But she hesitated. She remembered Aldrich's words, his refusal to stoop to the level of his enemies. She remembered her own values, her own beliefs, her own sense of justice. She lowered her sword.
"I will not kill you," she said.
"You will be judged by the law, not by my sword." At that moment, Aldrich entered the throne room, his sword dripping with blood, his face grim with determination. He saw Isolde standing over the defeated king, her sword lowered, her expression resolute. He approached her, his eyes filled with admiration and love. "You did well," he said, his voice soft. She smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that defied the cold, stone walls of the throne room.
"We did well," she said.
Theodore was taken prisoner, his reign of terror finally over. The kingdom rejoiced, celebrating their newfound freedom, their liberation from tyranny. Aldrich and Isolde, hailed as heroes, were offered the crown, the opportunity to rule the kingdom together. But Aldrich, remembering the burdens of leadership and the sacrifices he had made, declined. He proposed that a council of nobles be formed, a council that would represent all the regions of the kingdom, a council that would rule justly and fairly, guided by the principles of honor, integrity, and compassion. The council was formed, and Aldrich and Isolde, though not rulers in name, became its most trusted advisors, their wisdom and their courage guiding the kingdom towards a new era of peace and prosperity. Alara of Lormont, her treachery exposed, was banished from the kingdom, her ambitions shattered, her reputation ruined. She disappeared into obscurity, a bitter and defeated woman. Aldrich and Isolde returned to Evermere, their home, their sanctuary. They had faced death, betrayal, and war, and they had emerged victorious, their love and their loyalty their strongest weapons. They rebuilt Evermere, restoring it to its former glory, making it a place of warmth, laughter, and peace. They ruled their lands justly and wisely, guided by the principles of compassion and understanding. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' courage, their intelligence, and their unwavering commitment to justice. Aldrich and Isolde lived long and happy lives, their love story becoming a legend, a tale told and retold throughout the kingdom, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The reckoning of love and duty had been achieved, not through bloodshed and vengeance, but through courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The kingdom was safe, their love secure, and their legacy assured.
Epilogue.
Years passed, turning into decades. The silver in Aldrich's hair became more pronounced, mirroring the fine lines that etched themselves around Isolde's eyes, testament to years of laughter, worry, and the quiet joys of a life well lived. Evermere flourished under their wise and compassionate guidance, its walls echoing not with the cries of war, but with the delighted shrieks of grandchildren playing in the courtyard where the gallows had once stood. The memory of the rebellion, of the dark days of King Theodore's reign, faded into the realm of legend, recounted in ballads sung by minstrels in the great hall. The story of the Iron Wolf and the Lady of Evermere became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love and loyalty could triumph over tyranny and betrayal. Aldrich, though he had laid down his sword many years ago, still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior, his gray eyes still sharp and alert, his presence still commanding respect and affection. He spent his days overseeing the estate, advising the council, and sharing his wisdom with his children and grandchildren. Isolde, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, remained the heart of Evermere, her warmth and compassion radiating throughout the castle. She tended to the gardens, oversaw the household, and shared her stories with the younger generation, her voice still strong and clear, her spirit unbroken. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Aldrich and Isolde found themselves standing on the battlements of Evermere, looking out over the lands they had fought so hard to protect. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of a wolf's howl. It was a lonely sound, but also a proud sound, a reminder of the wildness that still existed in the world, the wildness that Aldrich had once embraced, the wildness that Isolde had helped him to tame. Aldrich reached out and took Isolde's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Their hands, once strong and youthful, were now weathered and worn, but their grip remained firm, a testament to their enduring love and loyalty. "We have come a long way, my love," Aldrich said, his voice soft, his gray eyes filled with a deep affection. Isolde smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that defied the chill evening air.
"We have," she said.
"And we have done it together." They stood there in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped, their hearts connected, their souls intertwined. They had faced death, betrayal, and war, and they had emerged victorious, their love stronger than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, Aldrich leaned down and kissed Isolde, a gentle, tender kiss that was filled with a lifetime of love, respect, and gratitude. It was a kiss that sealed their story, a story of courage, compassion, and the enduring power of the human spirit. A story of a knight and a lady, a wolf and a lioness, who had found love in the midst of chaos, who had fought for justice in the face of tyranny, and who had built a legacy of peace and prosperity that would endure for generations to come. The sun set on their long and fulfilling lives, leaving behind a world forever changed by their courage and their love. The wind carried their story, a whisper of hope and resilience, across the land they had saved.